like companies out there doing smart NPCs now inside video games.
Right, but what would be the difference between looking at what is possible in the future and making either a hypothesis or suggesting that that has already taken place?
Right, so that's kind of the leap, right, that you need to make, which is to say that if we can do it, now let's imagine a civilization that was 1,000,000 years ahead of us, 1,000 years ahead of us.
Yeah.
Even 200 years ahead of us, right? But certainly 1,000 years ahead of us. So where will computers be in 1,000 years? They would already have created these types of simulations.
Right.
Right? Because the point is, if they already got there, they created a whole bunch of simulations, okay? And you can't tell the difference whether you're in the real world or a simulated world, right? So there's 99 of these, there's one of these, but you can't tell the difference. So which one are you more likely in? Just statistically speaking now, we're not even projecting the technology forward. We're just saying it's more likely you're in one of the 99 than the one because there's so many more of these, right?
Sort of.
If you can't tell the difference, right?
If you can't tell the difference. But there's so many things you have to think about, right? There's so many things you have to take into consideration. One of them is we don't have a straight linear line from the moment that we're born to the moment that we exist in currently. The reason being is that we go to sleep every night.
Right.
It's a weird thing. We shut off every night. And we wake up intermittently, and you go back to bed. Maybe you have to pee. Maybe you're thirsty. You go back to bed. And then you wake up again. But when you wake up, you are just waking up. Like when I woke up this morning, I don't know if this is the life I've always lived.
Right.
I'm assuming it is because I have all these detailed memories of the past. I see my dog. He reacts the exact same way he always does. I see my wife, I see my kids, I see my house. It's the same house that I remember, but I'm not sure. I just woke up.
Right.
I'm a little foggy already.
It just exists in your memory at that point.
It just exists in your memory.
And so
this might be the first day of my life.
Right. If suppose that you can implant false memories, right?
Right.
So this was a popular topic for Philip K. Dick, right?
Yes.
Movies like Total Recall, and even in Blade Runner. Right? I interviewed his wife while I was researching, my book.
He was a wild boy.
He was an interesting guy, right?
Yeah.
And he said some interesting things. In fact, all the way back in 1977 in Metz, France, at a sci-fi convention, he said, there's a pretty famous quote. He said, "We are living in a computer-programmed reality. And the only clue we have to it is if some variable is changed, some alteration occurs in our reality." Right? And that's become kind of a famous quote in the simulation world. But if you listen to the rest of the quote, he says, well, we would basically rerun the same events and we would change some variables. Right? And we would have a sense of deja vu, like maybe we've already done this, right? Maybe I've, talked to you before,
right?
In a different run of the simulation, right? And this idea, like after I wrote my first book on this topic, the simulation hypothesis, this idea wouldn't leave me that, well, if you can run one simulation, you can certainly run it multiple times. In fact, that's what we would do, right? If we were running a simulation of the weather, we wouldn't just run it once. We would run it multiple times, and if we were doing simulation of whatever, right, pandemic, anything, name it, we would change the variables, and we would go forward. And so, when I interviewed Tessa, Philip K. Dick's last wife, she said that he came to believe this was really happening, right? That someone was altering with our reality, and they would change a few variables and rerun the simulation forward. So now we're getting pretty deep in the rabbit hole. So this is the topic of my second book, which is called The Simulated Multiverse. This idea that each of these timelines could be like a different run of the simulation itself. So that gets a little weird at that point, right? Because now we're saying that time isn't the same thing, right, that we think it is. So with the simulation hypothesis, we're saying that space doesn't really exist. It basically gets rendered for us like a video game. And then with this second idea, we're saying that time doesn't really exist because what you remember could have been either implanted memories or it could be a specific run of the simulation, right? So if you run it again, maybe things are slightly different the second time you run it. So Philip K. Dick came to believe that his novel, The Man in the High Castle, which was turned into a pretty cool series. I don't know if you've seen it. It was on Amazon a few years ago. But in the novel and in the series, Germany and Japan won World War II. And so you see in America that's been divided. Like the East Coast is run by the Germans, the West Coast is run by the Japanese, and you see this kind of fascist type world. And so, he later came to believe that this actually happened, and somehow the simulators reran it again, and the current timeline is one that was allowed to go forward, further forward than where that one might have ended. And so he says that at some point, all these memories came flooding back to him of this other timeline. He called it, he used this Greek word, it's called an anamnesis, which means a loss of forgetfulness, right? So he said, we might be able to remember these other runs of the simulation. So anyway, that gets us into, this whole idea of, is the past what we think it is, right? That's, I think, the question you were asking, right? Because you're like, if I just remember X, Y, Z, is that what actually happened? Or is it just a representation of the past in the present?
Yeah.
And so when I started looking into the quantum physics side of it, I found something really weird. And we can talk about the observer effect, but this was like even weirder than that. And it was something proposed by John Wheeler, who was at Princeton with Einstein, and he was a bit younger than Niels Bohr and Einstein and all these kind of forefathers of quantum mechanics. And he came up with several things that I was talking about, but one of them is the delayed choice experiment, or the cosmic delayed choice experiment, which puts into doubt this idea of the past. And since we're talking about the past, let's go into this now, if you don't mind.
Okay.
So imagine there's something like a quasar, and that's 1 billion light years away from us, right? And the light is coming from that quasar to here, so it's going to take 1 billion years to get here because it's 1 billion light years away. And then suppose there's something in the middle, like a black hole that's in the middle, or a galaxy, something that's very gravitationally big. And so suppose the light has to go to the left or to the right of that object. And suppose that object is like 1 million light years away from us.